The paralyzed female CEO gave a quiet, selfless gift to a poor mechanic, unaware he was the only one who could save her shattered soul. You are a disgrace to this family's memory, sitting there in that chair. The rain hammered down on the glass roof of the penthouse like 1,000 desperate fists, a relentless and wild symphony of sorrow that perfectly mirrored the storm inside Alara Vance's heart. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the vast, high-ceiling living room for a split second, revealing polished marble floors and minimalist furniture that screamed wealth but offered no warmth, before darkness swallowed it whole. She was a ghost in her own home. Her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling window was a pale, haunted thing, a woman encased in a gleaming chrome throne that had become both her prison and her world. The city below was a sprawling nebula of golden light, a world of movement and life that she could see but no longer touch, a constant, glittering reminder of everything she had lost. Her fingers, long and elegant, clenched on the worn fabric of the blanket draped over her useless legs, the knuckles white and trembling. The silence in the room was a living entity, broken only by the storm outside and the soft, almost imperceptible whir of the chair's electronics. It was a sterile silence, curated and expensive, the kind that amplifies the frantic thudding of a lonely heart until it becomes an unbearable drumbeat of despair. Her assistant, Clara, entered the room with a soft click of the door, her kind face etched with a familiar, weary concern. She held a sleek tablet, its screen glowing with an amber hue in the dim light. "Ma'am, your 7 o'clock is confirmed," she said, her voice gentle, as if speaking to a startled fawn. "A table at Aria, Mr. Sterling, will meet you there." Alara didn't turn, her gaze remaining fixed on the rain-streaked glass, on the distorted, weeping city. Another blind date, another well-meaning attempt by Clara to coax her back into the world of the living, a world that felt alien and hostile now. Each suitor was the same, a man of impeccable breeding and crisp suits, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and a calculating assessment of her net worth, always careful not to look too long at the chair, as if it were a grotesque piece of modern art. They spoke of mergers and portfolios, their voices smooth and polished, but their discomfort was a palpable thing, a heavy fog between them. They saw the Vance fortune, the commanding intellect that had built an empire, but they flinched from the shattered woman who came with it. "Cancel it." Alara's voice was a low murmur, brittle and thin, like ice cracking under pressure. She felt a familiar tightening in her chest, the biting cold of anxiety that preceded these farcical encounters. The thought of feigning interest, of enduring the unspoken questions and the careful, patronizing smiles, was a weight too heavy to bear tonight. "Please, Alara." Clara's voice softened further, taking on the tender, pleading tone she reserved for these moments. "Julian Sterling comes from a good family. He understands the pressures of your world. Just one dinner. For me, the pressure of her world." Clara meant the world of boardrooms and stock prices, but Alara's world now was one of chronic pain, of phantom itches on legs that couldn't feel, of the hollow ache of a love so profound its absence had splintered her very soul. The accident hadn't just taken her ability to walk. It had taken Liam. It had taken everything. Every corner of this cavernous apartment echoed with his laughter. Every shadow seemed to hold his form. The life they were supposed to build together had vanished in a screech of tires and a flash of shattering glass. A long, shuddering breath escaped her lips. She finally turned the chair, its motors humming a quiet lament. The flickering light from a single ornate lamp caught the glistening track of a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "Fine," she conceded, the word tasting like ash. "But Clara." This is the last time. Clara's smile was immediate and grateful, a small sunbeam in the gloom. "Of course, ma'am. I'll have Robert bring the van around." Alara watched her leave, the hope in her assistant's eyes a stark contrast to the desolate landscape of her own heart. She wheeled herself towards the bedroom, the movement smooth and silent across the marble. She passed a polished table where a single silver frame sat. In it, a smiling man with kind eyes had his arm wrapped around her. A version of herself so full of light and life, she barely recognized the woman anymore. They were standing on a beach, the sun setting behind them, and she was on her own 2 feet, strong and unwavering. A sob caught in her throat, raw and sharp. She forced it down, her jaw clenched. She would go to this dinner. She would wear her armor of polite indifference. She would endure. That was all she did now. She endured. The restaurant, Aria, was a symphony of hushed tones and gleaming surfaces. A place where wealth was not displayed but simply inhaled with the artfully scented air. Julian Sterling was exactly as she'd expected. Handsome in a bland corporate way, with a smile that didn't reach his cold, assessing eyes. He talked about his polo ponies and his recent acquisition of a rival tech firm, his words a meaningless drone. He barely looked at her, directing his conversation to a point somewhere over her left shoulder. He made a clumsy, over-the-top show of helping the waiter move a chair out of the way for her, a public performance of magnanimity that made her skin crawl. She felt like an exhibit, the paralyzed CEO, a curiosity to be observed. Her heart felt like a lead weight in her chest. The food was exquisite, but she tasted nothing, each bite an exercise in mechanical motion. She just wanted it to be over. She wanted the sterile silence of her penthouse, a silence that was at least honest in its emptiness. This polite, suffocating charade was so much worse. She felt a desperate, clawing need to escape. She was drowning. Across the opulent dining room, Kalen Ross felt his own quiet humiliation. The relentless hammering of the rain outside seemed to mock the frantic thudding in his chest. He'd just finished a 16-hour shift at the garage. His hands still stained with grease, he couldn't quite scrub from beneath his nails, and had only stopped in for a bowl of the fancy soup his late wife, Sarah, had loved. It was their anniversary, a sacred, painful day he always marked with this small, solitary ritual. But as he stood at the counter to pay for the takeout order, his worn wallet produced a declined debit card. He fumbled for cash, his pockets turning up only a few crumpled bills. Not nearly enough. The hostess's polite smile tightened, her eyes flicking from his grease-stained work jacket to the waiting line behind him. A flush of heat crept up his neck. He was just a man trying to honor a memory, and suddenly he was a public nuisance, a piece of grit in this gleaming machine of wealth. He saw the man at the nearby table, Julian, scoff, a small, cruel smirk playing on his lips as he leaned over to whisper something to his companion in the wheelchair. Cale's jaw tightened. He started to apologize, to tell them to just cancel the order, when a quiet, steady voice cut through the air. "Put it on my bill," the voice said. It was low and clear, without a hint of pity. Cale looked over and saw the woman in the wheelchair looking not at him, but at the hostess, her expression unreadable, almost cold. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The hostess, recognizing the commanding air of a regular patron, immediately complied, tapping a few buttons on her screen. "Of course, Ms. Vance," she said, her smile suddenly genuine and warm. The transaction was over in seconds. Cale stood there, stunned into silence. He opened his mouth to protest, to thank her, but her companion, Julian, was already rising, his face a mask of thunderous fury. "What do you think you're doing?" he hissed, his voice a low snarl meant only for her. "Embarrassing me like this? Helping that riffraff?" The woman, Ms. Vance, didn't flinch. Her gaze, when it finally met Cale's, was hollow, but for a split second, he saw something else in their depths. A flicker of profound, shared weariness. A moment of unspoken connection between two people drowning in their own separate oceans of grief. He saw her. Before he could find his voice, her assistant was there, materializing from the shadows to expertly maneuver the wheelchair towards the exit. Alara's face was a pale, dignified mask once more, betraying nothing of the storm that had just broken over her table. She vanished into the rainy night. Cale was left standing there, holding a warm paper bag that smelled of rosemary and thyme. A small act of kindness from a complete stranger stinging his eyes with unexpected tears. Julian Sterling stormed past him, muttering about a wasted evening. The hostess handed him the receipt for his own records. It was blank, paid for by Table 17. He looked at the slip of paper, at the elegant script of the restaurant's logo. Aria. He didn't know it yet, But that single, selfless act, born from a moment of shared humanity in a room full of artifice, had just set in motion a seismic shift in the tectonic plates of his own shattered life. A new purpose had just been quietly born in the wreckage of the old one. He had to find her. The drive home was a tense, unbearable silence, broken only by the rhythmic swish of the wipers on the modified van's windshield. Julian's earlier tirade echoed in Alara's mind, each word a poisoned dart. Embarrassing, riffraff, have you no sense of decorum? He had accused her of deliberately humiliating him, as if her small act of compassion was a calculated attack on his social standing. The sheer, unadulterated elitism of it had left her speechless, not with anger, but with a deep, bone-aching weariness. Was this what her world had become? A place so sterile and transactional that a simple kindness was seen as a strategic misstep? The man in the restaurant, with his worn jacket and grease-stained hands, had possessed more dignity in his quiet embarrassment than Julian Sterling would ever have in his entire polished life. His eyes, when they had met hers, had held a flicker of something raw and real, a depth of experience that she recognized in herself. For a fleeting moment, she hadn't felt like a broken CEO in a wheelchair. She had felt seen. The feeling vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by the familiar, crushing weight of her reality. When they finally arrived back at the gleaming, empty penthouse, she dismissed her driver and Clara with a curt nod, the mask of cold indifference firmly back in place. She needed to be alone. The moment the heavy door clicked shut, plunging the foyer into a soft hush, her composure crumbled. A dry, ragged sob escaped her lips. She wheeled herself furiously through the cavernous rooms, the sound of the chair's motors a frantic hum against the polished marble. She was not just trapped in a body that had betrayed her. She was trapped in a life that felt like a gilded cage, surrounded by people who saw her as either a tragic figure to be pitted or a commodity to be leveraged. The loneliness was a physical entity, a biting cold that no expensive throw blanket could warm. She stopped before the window again, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. The rain had softened to a drizzle, and the city lights shimmered and blurred through her tears, a beautiful, painful abstraction. Why had she helped that man? It wasn't a conscious decision. It was an instinct, a muscle memory from a life before this one. The life where she and Liam would anonymously pay for a young couple's dinner or leave an extravagant tip for a struggling waiter. It was a faint echo of the woman she used to be. A woman who believed in kindness. A woman who believed in connection. That woman felt like a stranger now. Meanwhile, Cale sat in his small, cluttered apartment above the garage, the takeout container of soup sitting unopened on his workbench. The scent of rosemary filled the air, a ghost of a memory. He couldn't bring himself to eat it. He kept replaying the scene at the restaurant over and over in his mind. The woman's quiet, commanding voice, the flicker of understanding in her haunted eyes, the fury on her companion's face. He knew that look of entitled rage. He'd seen it countless times from wealthy clients at the garage who treated him like a piece of the machinery. But she had been different. In that brief, charged moment, she hadn't seen a mechanic or a charity case. She had seen a person. He smoothed out the receipt on the workbench. Arya, a quick search on his phone brought up a Society column photo from 6 months ago. Alara Vance, CEO of Vance Innovations, makes her first public appearance since the tragic accident that claimed the life of fiancé Liam Davenport. The woman in the photo was the same, yet entirely different. She was standing, smiling, her eyes bright with a life that had since been extinguished. The article detailed the car crash, her brilliant career, and her subsequent seclusion. A profound, aching sadness settled over him, a familiar companion. He knew grief. He lived in its house, ate at its table. The car crash that had taken his wife and daughter 3 years ago hadn't just shattered his life. It had hollowed him out, leaving a man who was an expert at fixing engines but couldn't begin to piece together his own broken heart. He went to work, he came home, he existed. He hadn't truly felt anything. Not anger, not joy, not hope, in years. But this woman, this Alara Vance, had stirred something in him. Her selfless act, performed while she was clearly in her own kind of pain, was like a single, clear note played in a room that had been silent for too long. It was a sign of a pure, resilient spirit refusing to be crushed. A quiet resolve formed within him, solid and unwavering. It wasn't about repaying the money. It was about honoring the gesture. It was about connecting with the one person who had managed to pierce through his own armor of numb detachment. He didn't know how, but he had to find a way to see her again, to let her know that her small act of kindness had mattered. It had reached across a crowded, heartless room and reminded him that he wasn't entirely alone in his sorrow. It had made him feel human again. His resolve led him down a path of quiet observation. Cale was a mechanic, a man who understood systems, who saw the subtle signs of wear and tear that others missed. He started with the van. He knew the high-end garage that serviced the Vance Innovations fleet, a place called Apex Motors. It took him a week, calling in a favor and showcasing his almost preternatural skill with complex European engines, but he got a job there. He was assigned to the lower priority accounts at first, changing oil and rotating tires on corporate sedans. But he watched. He waited. And after 2 weeks, the sleek, black, heavily modified Mercedes-Benz Sprinter van with the Vance logo on the side rolled into the service bay for its regular maintenance. The work order was standard: fluid check, brake inspection, system diagnostics. But Cale had a hunch. He had noticed a slight, almost imperceptible hesitation in the hydraulic lift as she was being brought out of the restaurant that night. No one else would have seen it, but to his trained eye, it was a flaw, a tiny imperfection in an otherwise flawless machine. He spent the entire night in the bay, long after the other mechanics had gone home, the cavernous garage lit only by his portable work lamp. He pored over the van's schematics, his grease-stained fingers tracing the intricate lines of the hydraulic and electrical systems. The official diagnostics showed nothing wrong. But Cale didn't trust the computers when it came to a person's safety. He trusted his hands, his ears, his instincts. He found it deep within the lift's housing. A microscopic fracture in a pressure valve, a tiny, ticking time bomb that would have eventually failed, likely at the most inopportune moment. It was the kind of flaw that resulted from a rushed post-market modification. He replaced the valve with a custom-milled part he fabricated himself, reinforcing the housing with a discipline born of years of practice. But he didn't stop there. He noticed the ride was stiffer than it needed to be. He fine-tuned the van's specialized suspension, calibrating it not for performance, but for comfort, aiming to minimize every tiny vibration from the road that might translate into pain for its passenger. He even noticed the interior dome light was a harsh, sterile LED. He replaced it with a warmer, softer bulb, the kind of small detail that no one would ever mention, but that might make the cold nights a little less stark. He logged the official repairs in the system but made no mention of his other adjustments. They were his secret, a quiet, anonymous gift, an unspoken thank you. A week later, Alara was being driven to a board meeting, her mind preoccupied with quarterly reports and market projections. But as the van moved through the city, something was different. The perpetual, jarring vibrations that usually sent waves of phantom pain through her legs were gone. The ride was impossibly smooth, like gliding on a cushion of air. When they arrived and her driver activated the lift, the usual slight shudder and groan of the hydraulics was replaced by a single, fluid, almost silent motion. It was a small change, a series of tiny improvements that no one else would have ever noticed. But for Alara, whose entire world was a landscape of meticulously managed sensations, it was a seismic shift. The absence of that familiar, dread-inducing jolt was a profound relief, a moment of unexpected grace in a life defined by physical discomfort. A flicker of curiosity, an emotion she hadn't felt in a long time, ignited within her. This wasn't a standard repair. This was the work of a craftsman, of someone who paid attention, someone who cared. When she returned to her office, she did something she hadn't done in months. She bypassed her entire executive chain and made a direct call herself. "Clara," she said, her voice firm and clear, "get me the head of service at Apex Motors on the line. I want to know the name of the mechanic who worked on my van last week. I want to meet him." The garage was a world away from her own. The air smelled of oil, rubber, and hot metal, a scent she found surprisingly honest and grounding. It was a place of purpose, of tangible problems and concrete solutions. Cale stood by a workbench, wiping his hands on a red rag, his back to her as Clara wheeled her in. He was wearing the same worn work jacket. When he turned, his eyes widened slightly in recognition. He hadn't expected this. He had intended his actions to remain anonymous, a quiet balancing of a cosmic scale. "Ms. Vance," he said, his voice a low rumble. He quickly wiped a stray smudge of grease from his cheek, a gesture of self-consciousness she found oddly endearing. "They told me you wanted to see me." Elara studied him. In the harsh fluorescent light of the garage, she could see the faint lines of exhaustion etched around his steady, deep-set eyes. They were the eyes of a man who carried a heavy, unspoken burden. "The van," she began, her voice formal, betraying none of the strange flutter in her chest. "It's different, smoother. The lift. It's perfect." Cale simply nodded, his gaze unwavering. The pressure valve had a hairline fracture, and the suspension settings were off from the factory. Just needed a few adjustments. His explanation was simple, technical, devoid of any self-congratulation. He spoke of the machine, but she knew he had been thinking of the person inside it. An unaccustomed silence stretched between them. Clara hovered nervously in the background. "The restaurant," Elara said finally, the words coming out softer than she intended. "You're the man from the restaurant." He met her gaze directly. "Yes," he said. "I never got the chance to thank you." "There's no need," she said quickly, a faint flush rising on her pale cheeks. She felt a strange vulnerability under his calm, steady gaze. He wasn't looking at her with pity or awe or calculation. He was just looking at her as a person. Another silence fell, but this one was different. It was less awkward, more contemplative. She found herself gesturing to a simple metal stool near his workbench. "May I?" It was a strange request, to sit and talk in the middle of a noisy garage, but it felt more right than any of the five-star restaurants she'd been forced to endure. He nodded, clearing a space for her. Clara, sensing a shift in the atmosphere, quietly retreated to the waiting area. This was the beginning of their confession scene, held in the most unlikely of sanctuaries. Surrounded by the skeletons of dismantled engines and the hiss of pneumatic tools, they started to talk. It began with engines, with the simple, elegant logic of machines. He explained the intricate workings of a transmission with a quiet passion she found captivating. In turn, she spoke of the complex architecture of her company's software, finding a common language in the beauty of a well-designed system. The conversation slowly, carefully, drifted towards more personal territory. He gestured to a small, faded photograph taped to the inside of his toolbox. A smiling woman with a little girl on her shoulders, her face alight with pure joy. "My wife, Sarah, and my daughter, Lily," he said, his voice thick with a raw, unguarded emotion that cracked the air between them.
Car accident.
3 years ago, he didn't offer details. He didn't need to. The 2 words, car accident, were a universe of pain that she understood intimately. Her own composure, so carefully constructed, began to splinter. For the first time since it happened, she spoke of her own crash not as a news headline or a legal deposition, but as the moment her world ended. "His name was Liam," she whispered, her eyes fixed on a distant point, seeing not the garage but a winding coastal road at sunset. "We were arguing about something stupid, the color of the kitchen tiles for the house we were building." He was laughing, and then there were headlights. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, and she didn't bother to wipe it away. "I woke up in the hospital. They told me he was gone, and that I would never walk again." Sometimes I think the second part was a crueler fate. Cale didn't offer empty platitudes like, "He's in a better place," or "You're strong" instead. He did something incredibly simple and profoundly comforting. He walked over to a battered coffee machine in the corner, poured a murky-looking liquid into a stained ceramic mug, and placed it gently into her hands. The warmth of the mug seeped into her cold fingers. The silence is the worst part, isn't it? He said, his voice a quiet understanding. The house gets too quiet. She looked up at him, her eyes glistening. He saw her. He truly, completely saw the shattered woman behind the powerful CEO. He understood the unbearable weight of the silence. In the middle of that loud, chaotic garage, they had found a small, sacred pocket of quiet understanding, a bond forged in the crucible of shared, unbearable loss. And for the first time in over a year, Elara Vance felt a flicker, a tiny, fragile spark, of something that felt terrifyingly like hope. That fragile spark of hope, nurtured by their subsequent quiet conversations, grew into a quiet resolve. Kale became a fixed point in her meticulously scheduled life. She would find reasons to have her van serviced, and their talks in the corner of the garage became her sanctuary. He never pushed, never pried. He simply listened, his steady presence a balm on her raw nerves. He spoke of his daughter's love for ladybugs and the way his wife used to hum off-key when she cooked. In turn, she told him about Liam's terrible jokes and his dream of sailing around the world. They were two ghosts sharing memories of the lives they'd lost, and in doing so, they started to feel a little less invisible. It was Kale who gently encouraged her to re-engage with the world, not as a CEO, but as a person. "They're not seeing you, Elara," he'd said one afternoon, his hands busy cleaning a spark plug. "They're seeing the chair and the bank account. You need to make them see you again." His words resonated, and against her better judgment, she agreed to attend the annual Innovators Gala, the biggest event in the tech industry. It would be her first major public appearance. Felt like stepping off a cliff. The night of the gala, the air crackled with the energy of 1,000 camera flashes and the murmur of powerful voices. Elara felt a wave of nausea as she was wheeled into the cavernous, ornate ballroom. Every eye was on her. She could feel the weight of their pity, their curiosity. She held her head high, her face a mask of regal composure, but inside, her heart was pounding a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs. Kale had insisted on being her driver for the evening, a quiet, reassuring presence waiting just outside. The thought of him being nearby was the only thing keeping her from ordering her security to turn them around and flee back to the safety of her penthouse. She was navigating a sea of polite smiles and empty compliments when a voice, sharp and venomous, cut through the din. Well, if it isn't the Black Widow herself. "I'm surprised you have the nerve to show your face here," Elara froze. The voice belonged to Eleanor Davenport, Liam's mother, a woman who, in her grief, had decided Elara was not a fellow mourner but the sole architect of her son's death. Mrs. Davenport stood before her, her face a mask of aristocratic cruelty, her diamonds glittering like chips of ice. The crowd around them fell into a sudden, rapt silence. This was the beginning of the public humiliation, the moment the wolves smelled blood. "Look at you," she sneered, her voice carrying across the hushed ballroom. "Sitting there in your $1,000 dress, pretending to be a tragic hero. You are a disgrace to my son's memory." Each word was a physical blow. Elara's breath hitched, the room starting to spin. She could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes on her, feasting on the drama. "You were always too ambitious, too cold. You pushed him, drove him to be as reckless as you were. That accident was no accident. It was the price of your ambition, and my son paid it while you got to live." Elara's dignity was her only shield, but it was cracking. She could feel tears welling, hot and shameful. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She was helpless, pinned by the woman's hatred and the audience's morbid fascination. She was utterly, completely alone. And then, a calm, commanding presence cut through the circle of onlookers. Kale. He had left his post by the van, drawn by the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. He walked directly to Elara's side, placing a steady, reassuring hand on the back of her wheelchair. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo, just his simple, clean black jacket. He looked entirely out of place, and yet he possessed a quiet authority that silenced the room more effectively than any shout could have. He ignored the gasps and whispers, his focus entirely on the older woman. This was the salvation. "You should be ashamed of yourself," he said, his voice not loud, but carrying an immense weight of moral clarity. It echoed in the sudden, sterile silence. Mrs. Davenport's eyes narrowed. "And who are you?" "The help." Cale's gaze was unwavering. "I'm someone who knows what real strength looks like," he said, his eyes flicking for a moment to Alara's pale, trembling face before returning to her tormentor. "I've seen this woman face more in the last year than you've likely faced in your entire pampered life. And she has done it with a quiet, selfless dignity that you clearly know nothing about." He took a small step forward, effectively shielding Alara from the venomous glare. "You talk about your son," he continued, his voice resonating with the raw power of his own grief. "I lost my wife and my little girl. I know what that hole in your life feels like. But you don't get to fill it by pouring your poison into someone else's wounds. That isn't grief. It's cruelty." He then turned his attention slightly, addressing the silent, watching crowd. "You all see a woman in a wheelchair, but I know the truth. I saw her at a restaurant one night, when a smug, wealthy man was mocking a stranger who couldn't pay his bill. And this woman, without a moment's hesitation, without any expectation of thanks, paid that stranger's bill. That stranger was me." A collective gasp went through the room. The power dynamic had been completely reversed. He had revealed not wealth or status, but character. He had held up her virtue as a shield and a sword. "This woman," Cale said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "yet more powerful than ever, has more integrity and compassion in her little finger than this entire room combined. She is not the one who is crippled here." Total silence. Mrs. Davenport stood speechless, her face ashen, her cruelty exposed and deflated under the weight of his simple, undeniable truth. Cale gently turned Alara's chair. "Let's go home," he said softly, his voice meant only for her, and he wheeled her out of that cavernous ballroom, leaving a sea of stunned, shamed faces in their wake. The journey back to the penthouse was enveloped in a profound, unspoken tenderness. The sleek interior of the van, usually a symbol of her isolation, felt like a protective cocoon. Cale drove in a steady, comforting silence, his presence a solid anchor in the swirling vortex of her emotions. The adrenaline from the confrontation at the gala had worn off, leaving behind a raw, trembling vulnerability. The tears she had held back so fiercely now streamed down her face in silent, cathartic torrents. She didn't try to hide them. With Cale, she didn't have to wear her armor. When they arrived, he didn't hand her off to her staff as protocol dictated. He dismissed the waiting night nurse with a quiet word and wheeled her into the elevator himself. The sterile silence of her apartment greeted them, but tonight, it didn't feel empty. It felt safe. He maneuvered her to the great window overlooking the city, the glittering expanse of lights now seeming less like a taunt and more like a shared vista. He knelt before her, his eye level with hers, and gently, with a surprising tenderness, used his thumb to wipe a tear from her cheek. His touch was warm, steady, and utterly respectful. It wasn't a gesture of pity. It was a gesture of profound empathy. "You don't have to say anything," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble that seemed to soothe the frantic fluttering in her chest. "Just breathe." And she did. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the first truly full breath she felt she had taken in over a year. She looked into his eyes and saw her own grief reflected there, but she also saw something else. An unwavering strength, a deep well of kindness, and a tenderness that was directed entirely at her. Not at the CEO, not at the tragic figure, but at Alara, the woman. "No one," she whispered, her voice cracking, "has ever stood up for me like that, not even when I could stand on my own." He offered a small, sad smile. It's easy to stand up for the truth in that moment. The last of her defenses washed away. The fear, the cynicism, the carefully constructed walls she had built around her shattered heart, they all dissolved under the warmth of his gaze. She saw him not as a mechanic, but as her savior. Not a savior who had magically fixed her legs, but one who was patiently, gently, healing her soul. He was the only person who had bothered to look past the wreckage and see the person still trapped inside. He didn't make a grand, romantic declaration full of flowery promises. His words were simple, grounded, and more powerful than any poem. When I lost Sarah and Lily, he began, his voice thick with emotion, my world went gray. I just stopped feeling. I was fixing cars, but I was broken. And then I met you. He looked down at his own calloused hands, then back up at her. That night in the restaurant, your kindness, it was like a flicker of color in all that gray. It woke something up in me. You taught me how to feel again, Elara. He reached out, his hand covering hers where it rested on the arm of her chair. His touch sent a current of warmth through her entire body. I know your life is complicated, he continued, his gaze earnest and unwavering. And I know I don't fit into your world of boardrooms and galas. But I don't care about that. I care about you. He paused, his next words forming the most profound vow she had ever heard. You never expected to smile again. I know that feeling. So let me help you. Let me be the reason you do. I'm not going anywhere. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, promise. And in the quiet of her cavernous penthouse, with the city lights twinkling below them like 1,000 fallen stars, Elara Vance finally, truly, began to come home. She leaned forward, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she smiled. A real, genuine, soul-deep smile. 1 year later, the golden glow of the late afternoon sun filtered through the leaves of a sprawling oak tree, dappling the park in warm, shifting patterns of light. The sound was not of silence, but of life. The distant laughter of children, the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze, the soft hum of conversation. Elara Vance sat in her wheelchair, not on the periphery, but in the very heart of it all. The haunted, hollow look in her eyes was gone, replaced by a serene, luminous light. Her face, once a pale mask of dignified suffering, was now relaxed, quick to break into a smile that reached her eyes and made them sparkle. She was still in the chair, but it was no longer her prison. It was simply a part of her, a tool that carried her through a life she was now fully, joyfully living. Cale sat on the grass beside her, leaning against the wheel of her chair, a comfortable, familiar position. He was reading aloud from a worn paperback book, his low, rumbling voice a soothing melody. He was no longer just a mechanic. His innate understanding of systems and his deep empathy had found a new home. He was now the head of the new Vance Accessibility Foundation, a heavily funded research and development division of her company. Their mission, conceived during their late-night talks, was to create elegant, innovative, and affordable accessibility technology, not as medical equipment, but as tools for a life without limits. Their first project, a revolutionary lightweight chair design, was already in its final prototype stage. They were a team, in work, in healing, in life. He paused his reading and looked up at her, a quiet chuckle in his throat. You're not even listening, are you? He teased. She smiled, reaching down to thread her fingers through his. I'm listening to everything that matters, she replied, her voice soft. Their love wasn't a fiery, dramatic passion. It was a quiet, steady flame that had been kindled in the embers of their shared grief and now burned with a gentle, unwavering warmth. It was in the easy silences between them, the shared glances, the comfortable way their hands fit together. It was a love built not on grand gestures, but on a foundation of sacred, unspoken understanding. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. In the distance, a child's rattle shook with delight. A young couple shared a blanket on the grass. Life, in all its simple, profound beauty, was happening all around them, and for the first time in a very long time, Elara felt like she was a part of it. She was no longer the paralyzed CEO. She was just Elara, and she was happy. She was whole. This story is a testament to the profound, healing power of a single act of kindness. It illustrates how one's selfless gesture, offered without expectation, can ripple outward, changing the very fabric of two shattered lives. Elara, trapped in a world of wealth and isolation, performed an act of compassion that awakened the heart of Cale, a man numbed by his own unbearable loss. In turn, his quiet strength and unwavering empathy became the key that unlocked her from her own prison of grief. Their journey reminds us that our deepest wounds are often invisible, and the person who seems to have it all may be the one who is suffering the most, while the one who appears to have nothing may possess the greatest riches of character and spirit. It is a fable of seeing beyond the surface, beyond the wheelchair, beyond the grease-stained hands, to the true, virtuous soul within. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the light that can be found in even the darkest of times, please take a moment to show your support. Your engagement helps us to continue creating narratives that celebrate the resilience of the human spirit and the sacred, redemptive power of love. We believe that stories like Alara and Kale's are more than just entertainment. They are a source of hope and inspiration in a world that so often feels transactional and cold. They are a reminder that true connection is the most valuable currency we possess. We invite you to join our community of viewers who cherish soulful and uplifting content. Please like this video, share it with someone who might need a message of hope today, and subscribe to Soulful Love Tales. By doing so, you ensure that you won't miss any of our future soul-stirring stories that aim to warm your heart and inspire your own acts of kindness.